Hi there, John Wilkinson again and History Made Easier. And this is the third video now that looks at the longer term context to Mao's rise to power. And this video looks at the way in which the Chinese people themselves responded to the Century of Humiliation. With defeat at the hands of the British in the First Opium War, followed by what was seen as humiliating treaties, and with serious floods and famine between 1848 and 1850, disunity and the withdrawal of the mandate of heaven, the right to rule, was always on the cards, and the Qing dynasty was further weakened by a series of major rebellions. Looking at the uprisings collectively, we can identify a number of significant factors. Not only was the Qing dynasty facing revolts from different regions, but it faced them simultaneously. And not just in the case of the Muslim revolts, ethnic, cultural and religious differences were a factor too. Particularly the notion of personal salvation in a new millennium, a new beginning, which, for a state that placed unity and order of the highest significance, was a serious matter. The rebellions were also lengthy in duration, the Qing dynasty finding it difficult to quell them. It's going to take me a few minutes to get to Sun Yat-sen, but we will get there. The beginning of the Century of Humiliation and the rebellions led to what could be regarded, though only in hindsight, as something of a nationalist debate as to how to respond to the foreign barbarian. Defend the Confucian way, or adopt at least some of the Western ways. This dilemma was seen in the self-strengthening movement, with reformers meeting opposition from conservatives. Essentially, it meant learning from the West with regard to science and technology, particularly military technology, whilst maintaining Confucian ways. One Qing official explained it as Chinese learning as the base, Western studies for use. Ultimately, however, the self-strengthening movement failed to arrest China's relative decline, that is, relative to the Western powers. The Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95, in which China suffered crushing defeats on both land and sea, seemed to offer the clearest evidence. Emperor Guangxu was sympathetic to the movement, and in June 1898, an edict committing the regime to reform was issued. A series of reforms were introduced that became collectively known as the 100 Days Reform Movement, or simply the 100 Days. All subjects were granted the right to petition the emperor. There were major changes to the civil service. Changes were also made to the education system with new schools and colleges. A Ministry of Agriculture was established, as well as bureaus for mines and railways, and provisions for the encouragement of trade were put in place. All the reforms followed Western examples. However, the reforms proved too radical and too extensive for the upper gentry, and the Empress Dowager Cixi now made her move. The emperor was placed under house arrest, and 6 of the leading reformers were arrested and quickly executed. Other reformers fled the country, amongst them Sun Yat-sen, who was to become the father of China's Republican movement. Then, in 1900, the Boxer Rising erupted and brought China to another crisis point. The dynasty was able to hold on to power, but only by a mixture of collusion with the foreigners, brutal repression, and some belated reforms. The Empress Dowager issued an edict attributing China's problems on the shortcomings of the emperor and the failure of officials. The self-strengthening movement was also criticised for being too limiting, and the edict called on senior officials to submit proposals for reforms. The government took a more active role in the economy, and the army was reformed. But the most far-reaching reform was the proposal made by the Empress Dowager in July 1905 to move towards a constitutional monarchy. It was the influence of Japan's victory in the Russo-Japanese War that prompted the regime to move. Japan had introduced constitutional reform in 1890, and its triumph in 1905 was seen as the triumph of constitutionalism over autocracy, in this case, Russia's. The reforms were positive. They were far more radical than anything China had seen before, yet they were not enough. They were not enough to end the Century of Humiliation, at least not quickly enough, and they fell short of giving genuine power to the educated gentry class. The most important revolutionary group at this point was led by Sun Yat-sen. Told you I'd get to him. Sun was educated abroad, wanted to see China adopt Western ideas, notably the three principles of the people: nationalism, socialism, and democracy. For Sun, nationalism meant ridding China of the foreign imperialists and restoring China's position as a sovereign state. Socialism required protecting Chinese industry from foreign powers, developing government-owned enterprises, and lifting the people out of poverty. Democracy, then, would enhance collective freedom rather than individual freedom. He also felt China could not modernize until it became a republic, and the belated reforms introduced by the Qing dynasty only fed growing demands for further reforms. The photograph shows Sun wearing a bowler hat, flanked by Republican officers. There are some out of the frame of the photo that I took from the book. And some advisors, one of them wearing a Homburg hat as well as an embroidered jacket. Meanwhile, as you can see in the next photograph, sporadic attacks on foreigners continued. Michael Lynch describes the years 1908 to 1911 as a revolution waiting to happen. Yet when it came, it seemed to come from nowhere. In fact, it began as a provincial matter only to quickly take on an epoch-changing significance. It led to delegates of the rebellious provinces gathering in Nanjing to declare a Chinese republic. Though Sun Yat-sen had played no part in the events, he was invited to be the republic's first president and was duly installed on January the 1st, 1912. Faced with insurrection, the Manchu government incredibly turned to Yuan Shikai, who had earlier been humiliated and sacked by them. Yuan obliged, but set out to avenge his humiliation. He marched south and easily retook the rebellious provinces. But on reaching Wuhan, somewhere that you might have heard about recently, he held back and proposed a deal with the revolutionaries that would make him president rather than Sun Yat-sen. And when Sun agreed, the deal was struck. Yuan then presented an ultimatum to the Manchus: abdicate or be overthrown. They chose to abdicate. This was indeed an epoch-making revolution. The oldest, the most populated country in the world, with an imperial system of government that had been in place before Christ, had fallen. Essentially, what had unfolded was a military coup. Radicals had taken the opportunity to put pressure on the Manchu government, but it was essentially a revolt of the provinces against the centre. And it was in the first instance a military revolt, and in the final act, a military coup. Democracy did not prevail, however, and neither was there anything like a clean break. The imperial family were given a very generous subsidy and were allowed to continue to live in the Forbidden City, their palace complex in the heart of Beijing. Many imperial positions remained in post, and corruption remained the order of the day. And Yuan quickly turned the republic into a dictatorship and attempted to turn it into an empire again. Republicanism didn't turn out very well. Yuan, declaring himself emperor in December 1915, though his reign actually began on January the 1st, 1916, but a succession of provinces rose in revolt and declared their independence from Beijing. More seriously, his generals defected, informing him that they would not serve him as emperor. Consequently, Yuan renounced the throne in March, just 3 months after taking it. Another 3 months later, with preparations in hand for his retirement, he died. To explain the photograph I'm showing of Yuan, after his dismissal by the Qing court, Yuan took on the persona of the traditional rural recluse. He's pictured here dressed in a straw cloak, meditating whilst fishing. This was an image in many a Chinese painting. China now plummeted into a messy 4-year period, with a republican government surviving in Beijing in the north, the nationalists in Nanjing in the south, and all across the province's warlords. The warlords were a disparate group. Some had been military governors under Yuan, others remained loyal to the Qing dynasty, some held to Confucian values, others were Christian, some were reformists, and at least one was little more than an utterly immoral bandit. The revolution of 1911 had proven to be a major disappointment, for it transpired that whilst Japan had coveted the German concessions from the outset of World War I, the Chinese Prime Minister Duan Shirui had secretly signed away Shandong in return for the Nishihara loans. Yuan and his government had also meekly accepted Japan's 21 demands in 1915. Consequently, China's appeals to the Big Three at Versailles, President Wilson particularly, based on the fact that China had sided with the Allies and that surely Wilson's principle of self-determination should apply, fell on deaf ears. But the decision at the Versailles Peace Conference to give Germany's imperialist concessions in Shandong province, the birthplace of China, home of the Yellow Emperor, the Middle Kingdom, and including the important port of Qingdao, giving it to Japan rather than reinstating full Chinese sovereignty, resulted in protests by university students in Beijing on May the 4th, 1919. These culminated in attacks on the offices and homes of ministers known to be in pay of the Japanese. A nationwide movement for national renewal had started and is still seen as one of the most defining moments in the national revolution. Many, historians included, regard it as more significant than the revolution of 1911. As well as demonstrations, there was a run on Japanese-owned banks. Chinese newspapers refused to accept advertisements for Japanese businesses, and merchants and shops refused to sell Japanese goods. But beyond the anti-Japanese sentiments was a call for greater democracy and for China to embrace science. It led to the resurrection of the Nationalist Party by Sun Yat-sen in 1919 and the formation of the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, in 1921. And there now seemed to be the possibility of an alliance between the intellectuals and the masses, at least the urban masses. Of profound significance was the shift in the way intellectuals viewed Western thought. For now, they saw the West as oppressors. This didn't lead them to turn their back on Western ideas, but China's problems, they now felt, would not be solved by adopting Western democracy and liberalism, but by socialism, itself critical of liberalism and capitalism, and so imperialism. The photograph you see shows Sun in the middle and in military uniform, Chiang Kai-shek. What became the climax of the May 4th movement underpinned the shared belief of nationalists and communists that the foreigner must be got rid of. On May the 30th, 1925, a crowd in Shanghai marched in protest against a shooting 2 weeks earlier of Shanghai Chinese workers by Japanese factory guards. Such were the numbers marching that the British commander of the Shanghai International Settlement ordered his forces to disperse the crowd with rifle fire. This overreaction resulted in a further 12 deaths. This, in turn, led to strikes and riots all over China, and in scenes reminiscent of the Boxer Rising, foreign legations were attacked. In Guangzhou, more than 50 protesters died when troops in the foreign concessions opened up on the crowd with machine guns. For days, any sense of law and order in both Guangzhou and Shanghai was lost. Control was restored, but the incident had served to demonstrate the intensity of the opposition felt by the Chinese against the presence of foreigners. What was also learned, underpinning the lesson learned by the communists at the hands of the warlords, was the hard truth that only military strength would rid China of both its external and internal enemies. Encouraged by the Soviet Union, a united front between the Chinese Communist Party and the Nationalists was formed in 1923. But it was always an uneasy relationship with suspicion on both sides. And with the death of Sun Yat-sen in March 1925 and Chiang Kai-shek's leadership of the Nationalists, the United Front quickly unravelled. Chiang saw the Communists as a threat. Nevertheless, when he set out on what came to be known as the Northern Expedition, that lasted from 1926 to 1928, with its aim to break the stranglehold of power of the warlords, he still needed their support, the support of the communists. He needed their help in rallying the support of the peasantry in the central provinces, which the expedition's forces would pass through. And he also needed the practical support of the Soviet Union to arm his troops. But for Chiang, there was always an equally important second aim to the Northern Expedition. Once the first had been achieved, he wanted to smash the communists. And with the warlords defeated, he duly turned on the communists in the White Terror. It was in Shanghai that the counter-revolution started, using information supplied by the city's triads and underworld gangsters, and with their active participation. On April the 12th, 1927, Chiang's troops attacked communist headquarters as well as trade unions in working class districts, and rooted out and shot some 5,000 communists as well as sympathisers. When resistance proved problematic, the army brought up machine guns and even field artillery. The assault, which was to last until 1930, was extended anywhere the nationalist forces were able to reach. It included the peasant associations in the countryside, which were utterly destroyed. It was a brutal campaign with executions of communists and horrific assaults on the peasantry that included disemboweling, gouging out eyes, cutting out tongues, and assaults on women. It was a determined attempt to achieve the second of Chiang's aims. In Hunan province alone, estimates of those killed in the initial campaign in the spring and early summer of 1927 lie between 250,000 and 400,000. China had not seen anything like it since the Taiping uprising in the middle of the 19th century. Chiang's attempt to smash the CCP almost succeeded. The CCP was almost wiped out, its ranks decimated, but it indeed survived, including this man. Do you recognize him? It's none other than Mao Zedong.